Ruby Hale had driven this stretch of Interstate 5 hundreds of times, but tonight the road felt like another world entirely as the storm swallowed every sign of life around her and pressed against the windshield with frantic sheets of rain that made the lanes dissolve into a trembling blur. The wipers moved furiously, yet barely kept up, and the wind howled hard enough to shove her small rescue truck sideways whenever an especially violent gust swept across the open stretch between Portland and the dark forested hills. Ruby kept both hands tight on the steering wheel and leaned forward with her eyes narrowed, reminding herself this was just another night shift for the Animal Rescue Center, and that she had survived far worse storms. But the silence of the empty highway gnawed at her. No headlights ahead, no taillights behind. Only the drumming of rain on metal and the crackle of distant thunder. She told herself she should never stop for anything in weather like this, not tonight. Not when visibility was this bad and danger hid in every shadow. Yet, only a minute later, her heart yanked hard in her chest when she saw a figure on the shoulder of the road, a pale shape barely visible through the downpour, swaying as if the wind might knock him over at any second. Ruby slowed, then questioned her own sanity, then slowed again. The man stumbled forward under the violent rain wearing a soaked white shirt plastered to his skin and mud streaked across the fabric as if he had fallen more than once. He had no jacket, no bag, not even a hat. Nothing that made sense. His arms were crossed over his chest for warmth, fingers trembling from cold, and every few seconds he glanced over his shoulder as if expecting someone to burst out of the wilderness behind him. When Ruby rolled down her window just enough to hear him, the freezing wind slapped her in the face. She called out, "Are you all right, sir? Do you need help?" But her voice almost vanished inside the roar of the storm. Before the man could respond, a black SUV shot past them at terrifying speed, its tires hissing over wet asphalt and its headlights sweeping across the stranger with a bright flash that made him flinch and duck his head as though the vehicle was hunting him. Ruby watched the SUV disappear into the rain and felt a chill crawl up her spine. Something about the way the man reacted was not normal. She opened her door halfway, still cautious. When the man lifted his hand, she noticed something metal glint in the faint light. A wedding band. A man's ring. But he was holding it as if it burned him. Then it slipped from his fingers and clinked onto the wet pavement beside his feet. He froze, staring at it with an expression so raw that Ruby felt something twist inside her. The danger was real. The fear was real. And yet so was the pain in his eyes. She should keep driving. She told herself that again and again. This was how people ended up in the news. A lone woman on a dark road stopping for a stranger who looked half broken and half dangerous. But another part of her, the part that spent every day pulling injured animals out of ditches and rescuing abandoned pets from strangers who did not care, refused to leave someone freezing alone in a storm. She swallowed hard and unlocked the passenger door. "Get in, you are freezing." The man hesitated only for a second before climbing into her truck with a shutter water dripping from his hair onto the seat, his chest rising and falling with quick, desperate breaths. Ruby shut the door firmly and pulled back onto the road, feeling the tires slip before they caught traction again. For a long moment they said nothing. The only sound, the storm battering the roof. Ruby glanced at him. His face was handsome but pale. Jaw-clenched eyes unfocused in a way that made him look both terrified and exhausted. He whispered a quiet thank you as if unused to receiving kindness. Ruby could not shake the feeling that she had just stepped into the beginning of something she did not understand. She could still hear the echo of that SUV racing past. She replayed the image of the man ducking away from its lights. She thought about the wedding band lying in the rain where he dropped it. Everything in her life until this moment had been predictable shifts, night rescues, muddy boots, quiet drives home. But tonight felt like the edge of a path she had not chosen, one that would pull her into someone else's storm. The air inside the truck grew heavy with questions she could not bring herself to ask. Instead, she whispered, "Are you sure you are all right?" because she felt the need to look out for him despite her fear. He stared out the window, rain streaking across the glass, and whispered in a voice that shook, "I do not know." Ruby felt her heartbeat quicken. Emotional tension rose inside her like a tide. fear colliding with curiosity, caution blending with instinctive compassion. She wanted to turn around and drop him at the nearest gas station. She wanted to lock the doors and keep driving. She wanted to understand what kind of life someone must be running from to end up on a deserted highway in a storm clutching a wedding ring he had abandoned. She did not know that this single choice to stop the car was the moment her life split in two, the life she had before, and the life she would have after meeting the stranger who looked at her as if she were the first real chance he had ever been given. The storm hammered against the truck as Ruby Hale kept her hand steady on the wheel, but her pulse refused to settle because the man beside her radiated the kind of tension that made the air feel electrically charged. He sat rigidly in the passenger seat, drenched clothes clinging to his shoulders, breath still uneven as if he had been running for longer than any normal person could endure. When Ruby finally spoke, her voice came out softer than she intended. "Sir, are you hurt? Do you need a hospital?" And she hated how unsure she sounded. The man shook his head sharply, droplets of rain flicking from his hair, and answered with a hoarse whisper, "Just drive." Ruby wanted to protest, but something in his tone made her grip the steering wheel instead. His hands were clasped tightly together, fingers trembling as though he was forcing them not to shake. After a moment, he spoke again, slower this time, as if remembering how to form his words. "My name is Adrian. Nothing else. No last name, no explanation, no attempt to reassure her that he was safe. Usually, people offered far more when they wanted help. They volunteered stories. They explained emergencies. They apologized. Adrian did none of that. He simply stared at the side mirror every few seconds, eyes sharp and watchful like someone who expected danger to appear from the darkness at any moment. Ruby noticed he kept one hand near the door handle as though preparing to bolt again. Something was deeply wrong. She offered him her rescue team jacket, the thick navy waterproof one that stayed in the back seat for long nights in the field. "Here, put this on. You are shaking." Adrian hesitated, then slipped it over his soaked shirt. The jacket dwarfed him, but he pulled it tight around himself with a grateful exhale. "Thank you," he murmured. It sounded like a word he had not used in years. Ruby nodded, but her mind raced. She watched the road carefully while sneaking glances at him, studying the dark circles beneath his eyes, the strain in his jaw, the unnatural way he kept flinching at flashes of lightning. Was he running from someone? Was he dangerous? Was she making the worst mistake of her life by letting him into her truck? As she changed lanes, Ruby reached for the radio, letting her fingers turn the dial on instinct just to fill the suffocating silence. Static hummed before a local traffic update crackled into the speakers. A male reporter announced in a steady voice that an earlier incident at the Westbrook Estate wedding had caused heavy police and security presence along the northern highways. Ruby barely processed it, but Adrian reacted instantly. "Turn it off!" His voice snapped through the truck like a whip. Ruby jolted and switched the radio off. The truck returned to storm-muffled silence, but her heart pounded faster. Adrian had gone completely rigid, breath, shallow eyes locked forward in terror instead of fear. Westbrook Estate wedding, she thought, but dared not ask. Instead, she tried again with caution. "You are not hurt, right? No one is chasing you." Adrian kept his gaze outside, watching the blur of trees under the rain-streaked glass, and said quietly, "People chase me for reasons that have nothing to do with crime." Ruby frowned. The answer was not reassuring, yet something in it told her he was telling the truth. A man who had something to hide would have denied everything. A man who was terrified of being found would dodge the question. But Adrian answered like someone who had been used to being misunderstood his whole life. Ruby felt a flicker of compassion soften the tightness in her chest. She asked, "Are you cold still?" Adrian shook his head, but Ruby could see the leftover trembling in his shoulders. It was not from the cold. It was from whatever he was running from. As the truck merged into a quieter stretch of highway, Ruby noticed Adrian glance into the rear mirror with sudden urgency. His brow creased. "There is a vehicle behind us." She checked and saw a pair of headlights cutting through the storm several lengths back. That could be anyone, she said, but Adrian pressed closer to the window. Not anyone. They have been there since we left the diner. Ruby wanted to tell him he was imagining things, stress making him paranoid, but the unease in her stomach grew. She pressed the gas a little harder. The headlights remained far but steady, always the same distance. Adrian inhaled slowly as though bracing himself. Ruby realized she needed to change the direction of his spiraling fear, or at least ground him. So she asked a simple question, hoping it would draw him back to the present. "Where were you going when I found you?" Adrian closed his eyes briefly and whispered, "Anywhere, away from where I was." His voice cracked on the last word. Ruby heard truth in it, pain too. She wanted to ask more, but sensed he was someone who had not been allowed to speak freely in a very long time. Instead, she offered the smallest comfort, "I will not press you. Just tell me if you need something." That surprised him. He turned toward her, studying her face with a mix of disbelief and gratitude. "You stopped for me," he murmured, as if the reality was still sinking in. "Most people would not." Ruby gave a hesitant shrug. "Most people do not work in animal rescue," she said, trying to inject a little humor, though it came out shaky. "I guess I am used to pulling scared things out of dangerous places." Adrian exhaled slowly and looked down at his hands. They were cleaner now after the rain had washed off the mud, but they still trembled faintly. "I am not dangerous," he whispered. "I am just lost." And for the first time since meeting him, Ruby believed him. The tension in her ribs loosened just slightly. She felt a soft pull of connection. Something fragile but real, formed out of fear and compassion, and the strange intimacy of being two strangers forced into the same small space during a storm that made the world outside disappear. She did not know his full name. She did not know his past. She did not know why the mention of the Westbrook wedding made him panic, or why a black SUV made him hide his face, or why he was clutching a wedding band as if it symbolized something unbearable. But she knew this much. Adrian was terrified, and she knew that she could no longer pretend she had not seen it. The rain eased only slightly as Ruby guided the truck off the highway and into the dimly lit parking lot of a 24-hour roadside diner. The kind of place that always smelled faintly of burnt coffee and frying oil, even from the outside. Neon lights flickered above the entrance, casting pink reflections across puddles that rippled in the lingering wind. Ruby killed the engine, and for a moment the sudden quiet felt unnerving after the storm's relentless roar. Adrian sat motionless, as if unsure whether he should follow her inside or vanish back into the night. She sensed the hesitation and offered a simple, gentle choice. "You can stay in the truck, but you look like you need something warm to drink." Adrian's eyes lifted toward the diner windows where silhouettes moved behind the fogged glass. He swallowed and nodded. "I will come." Ruby grabbed her rescue jacket from the back seat and placed it over his shoulders again, even though the diner was only a few feet away. He did not protest. They stepped into the storm for a brief moment before pushing through the diner door, where a gust of warm air rolled over them along with the scent of pancakes and damp clothing. The handful of customers turned to look because they walked in drenched, but most returned to their meals quickly. Only the waitress behind the counter offered a curious second glance. "Sit anywhere," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. Ruby led Adrian to a booth near the corner, far from the windows, where he kept glancing outside as though expecting someone to emerge from the dark. Ruby ordered 2 coffees because it was the only thing that made sense. Adrian wrapped his hands around the steaming mug as soon as it arrived, letting the heat soak into his trembling fingers. His shoulders lowered a fraction, as if the warmth unclenched something inside him. Ruby was just beginning to feel that maybe they had found a moment of breath when a loud voice cut through the diner. "Breaking news, everyone." Someone had turned up the volume on the small television mounted near the ceiling, and the entire room shifted toward the screen. A news anchor with perfectly polished hair spoke urgently over footage of a massive mansion illuminated by storm lights. Ruby barely paid attention at first until the words registered. Billionaire Groom Adrian Westbrook is missing after disappearing minutes before his scheduled wedding ceremony tonight at the Westbrook estate just outside Seattle. Ruby's breath caught in her throat. Beside her, Adrian froze as if lightning had struck him. The anchor continued. Authorities and private security are searching surrounding areas after guests reported the groom fled on foot following an unexpected disruption during the ceremony rehearsal. The screen cut to blurry footage taken by a guest cell phone. A man in a white shirt sprinting across the gravel drive, rain pouring over him, a black SUV, following only seconds behind. The camera zoomed shakily, capturing the mud smeared across his clothes and the panic in his movements, and every detail matched the man sitting across from Ruby. The diner erupted into whispers. "Oh my God, that is wild! A billionaire running away from his own wedding! What could have happened? Who even runs from a wedding like that?" Someone said, "Must be drugs or a scandal." Another muttered, "Must be guilt." The world always assumed the worst of people with money. Ruby glanced at Adrian, who had gone utterly pale, his hand sliding from the mug to the edge of the table, gripping as though it was the only thing anchoring him to the moment. She lowered her voice. "You are Adrian Westbrook." He shut his eyes tightly, as if bracing himself for the words he knew would follow. Ruby stared at him, the truth settling heavily in her chest. This man, whom she had found alone on a stormy highway, was not just running from something. He was running from the entire world. The waitress approached, oblivious to the tension. "Crazy story, right? Looks like that poor bride got left at the altar." She set napkins on the table and paused, noticing Adrian's soaked clothes more closely. "You okay, sir? You look like you have seen a ghost." Adrian forced a nod, but his voice was barely audible. "I am fine." Ruby thanked the waitress quickly, hoping to end the conversation, but the woman lingered a moment longer, studying Adrian's face before something seemed to click in her mind. Ruby caught the recognition just as Adrian did. His expression shifted into panic. She whispered urgently, "Go to the restroom now." He stood quickly, keeping his face low as he moved past curious eyes. Ruby watched him disappear down the narrow hallway near the back kitchen. The waitress approached Ruby in a lowered voice. "Is that him? The runaway groom, the one on TV?" Ruby's mind raced. She could not allow anyone to call security or the news or whoever was hunting him in that SUV, so she responded with calm, practiced neutrality. "I picked him up on the road." "Yes, but he said someone beat him up and stole his wallet. He is not that billionaire guy." The waitress eyed her, then shrugged. "Maybe. Just be careful, hon." Ruby breathed out slowly once the waitress left, because she had never lied so quickly or so convincingly in her life. Her heart pounded as she stood and hurried toward the hallway. She found Adrian leaning against the wall near the paper towel dispenser, his head bowed. Hands braced as though holding himself upright. He looked up when she approached, but his expression was hollow. Ruby spoke quietly but firmly. "We need to leave. Someone recognized you." His throat tightened and he whispered, "Do not let them call anyone. Please." Ruby searched his face and reality hit her with full force. She had stumbled into something far larger than a simple runaway groom headline. He was terrified of being caught not out of guilt, but out of desperation. The image of him ducking away from the SUV flashed through her mind. The wedding band falling from his shaking hand. The panic when hearing the radio mention the Westbrook wedding. This was not a spoiled billionaire fleeing responsibility. This was a man escaping a cage. She nodded resolutely. "I will get us out. Just follow me." When they stepped back into the dining area, the whispers grew louder because several diners were comparing footage on their phones to Adrian's face. Ruby grabbed his wrist gently and led him swiftly toward the exit. The storm outside felt safer than the questions inside. As the diner door slammed behind them, Ruby realized nothing about tonight was accidental. She had picked up a stranger, but fate had handed her something far more complicated and dangerous. Adrian Westbrook had not simply missed his wedding. He had run for his life, and now she was running with him. The storm swallowed them again the instant they stepped out of the diner, but this time Ruby Hale did not hesitate. She pulled Adrian toward the truck with a grip steadier than she felt inside. because the way people in the diner had begun whispering and lifting their phones meant they had minutes, maybe less, before someone tried to call security or the media or whoever had been following him in that black SUV. Adrian moved stiffly beside her as though the emotional blow of seeing himself on the news had gutted whatever strength he had left. By the time they climbed into the truck, he was shaking again, not from the cold, but from something deeper, something raw. Ruby started the engine and pulled out of the lot without turning on the headlights right away, letting the darkness hide them for a moment before merging back onto the highway. She kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting the SUV to appear again. It did not, but the fear inside her did not settle. When she finally spoke, her voice carried more steadiness than she expected. "Tell me the truth. Why were you running?" This time, there was no hesitation. Adrian stared out the passenger window, watching streaks of rain chase each other down the glass, and then he spoke with a quiet resignation as if the words had waited years to be released. "The wedding was not my choice. It never was." Ruby tightened her grip on the wheel but remained silent, letting him continue. "My family arranged everything," he said, slowly choosing each word. "The guest list, the location, the union of two companies. Even the vows were drafted by attorneys. The bride and I met only a handful of times. It was never about love, it was about merging the Westbrook Empire with the Armitage dynasty." Ruby blinked in disbelief. She had heard of corporate marriages in high society, but they always felt like exaggerated rumors, not real life. But hearing Adrian say it with that hollow tone made her stomach knot. She asked softly, "Did you try to say no?" Adrian gave a short, humorless exhale that was almost a laugh, but not quite. "My family does not understand the word no. They understand leverage, control, obligation. I was born to be the visible heir, the spokesperson, the bridge between two worlds of power." Ruby imagined growing up under that kind of weight, a life where every choice was scripted by someone else, where money bought everything except freedom. She asked what felt like the obvious question, why run tonight? Why not before? "Because tonight," he whispered, "was the one moment I realized I could not go through with it, even if it meant losing everything." Ruby slowed slightly when a truck splashed past them, sending arcs of water over their windshield. She waited until the road cleared again before asking, "What did your family do when you refused?" Adrian swallowed, his breath visible even in the dim light. "They sent the protection unit after me. Not for my safety, for their image. I was not supposed to leave the grounds. Not for air, not for clarity, and certainly not for a decision. My life was already written for me. I was expected to obey." His voice trembled at the last word, and Ruby felt something sharp twist in her chest. She imagined a massive estate filled with guests and cameras and executives, then the groom disappearing and a family more concerned about headlines than the person behind them. She whispered, "That SUV on the road. They were chasing you." He nodded once, tightening the jacket around himself. "They have been trained to retrieve me, not hurt me. But returning means the end of my choice, the end of me." The way he said it made Ruby's breath stall. She wondered how long he had lived like this, how many years he had spent being molded, shaped, assigned rather than heard. She asked carefully, "What was your childhood like?" Adrian leaned his head back against the seat, his eyes closing as if the memory itself exhausted him. "Controlled," he murmured. "Structured. My tutors were chosen by the board. My hobbies selected by advisors. My friends screened. Every hour optimized for the future the company expected from me. I never knew what I wanted because no one ever cared to ask." Ruby felt a lump rise in her throat. She had grown up with chaos and unpredictability, but at least she had freedom. Adrian Westbrook had grown up with everything except the one thing that mattered. She remembered the moment he dropped the wedding ring in the rain. The devastation on his face had not been about heartbreak or betrayal. It had been about suffocation. He whispered, "I thought I could endure it, but when I stood there tonight in front of hundreds of people waiting for me to recite words written by someone else, I just snapped. I ran without thinking. the storm felt safer than that life. Ruby breathed out slowly, letting the truth settle between them like a fragile confession neither of them had expected to share tonight. She glanced at him and saw not a billionaire heir running from responsibility, but a man drowning in a life built by others. She said quietly, "You are not wrong for wanting your life to be yours." Adrian opened his eyes and looked at her with a gratitude so vulnerable it almost startled her. "Most people would not understand," he whispered. "Most people would kill for what I have." Ruby shook her head, still watching the road. "Most people want freedom more than wealth. They just do not always get the choice." He studied her profile for a long moment, his gaze softer now, less frantic. "Why did you stop for me?" he asked quietly. "People do not usually stop for a stranger in a storm." Ruby considered her answer, then spoke honestly, "'Cause you looked like you were breaking, and I could not pretend I did not see it." Something in Adrian's face crumpled almost imperceptibly, as if her words struck a place that had long been neglected. His voice was almost a whisper. "You saw me before you knew who I was. That means everything." Ruby felt the weight of that truth settle around them, a delicate thread connecting two strangers pulled into the same night by circumstances neither could have predicted. She did not know how far she could go to help him or what they would face next, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Adrian Westbrook had not been running from a wedding. He had been running from a lifetime lived in a cage. The storm had settled into a steady, relentless downpour by the time Ruby guided the truck off a side exit to circle around toward a quieter road, but the calm did nothing to loosen the tight coil of fear inside her chest. Adrian sat beside her, pulled deep into the oversized rescue jacket, his posture straighter now, but his eyes still scanning every mirror with a haunted precision. The truth he had shared lingered heavily between them, transforming him from a mysterious stranger into someone terrifyingly human, someone trapped by wealth rather than protected by it. Ruby wanted to reassure him, wanted to convince herself that they were safe for at least a moment, but the unease crawling under her skin said otherwise. When they turned back onto a rural road running parallel to the highway, the distant glare of headlights appeared behind them, piercing through the rain like two unwavering white eyes. Ruby's grip tightened on the wheel. She hoped it was just another traveler, but Adrian inhaled sharply and shook his head almost instantly. "That is them. I know how they drive." Ruby's stomach dropped. The headlights grew larger, closing in with unmistakable intention. She pressed the gas, but the wet pavement offered little mercy and the truck fishtailed before regaining traction. Adrian braced a hand against the dashboard, breathing fast. "They will not hurt you," he said quickly, "but they will not stop until they take me back. They do not care who you are or what this does to your life." Ruby's mind raced. She thought of the diner customers, the whispers, the way the waitress stared too long. Someone probably made a call the moment they left. She turned at the next intersection, cutting sharply onto a narrow gravel service road that stretched behind a cluster of dark trees. The headlights followed. Ruby cursed under her breath. She did not owe this man anything but something about his desperation. Something about the way he looked at her when he said that she had seen him made her refuse to abandon him now. She drove faster, ignoring the pounding of her heart. Adrian pressed his shoulder to the seat as if anchoring himself. The service road dipped suddenly, and Ruby swerved to avoid a fallen branch. The truck bumped hard over uneven ground, but she kept going, watching through the rain-smeared mirror as the SUV followed with practiced ease. "They are trained for this, Adrian," whispered, sounding both apologetic and defeated. Ruby met his gaze for half a second, then focused ahead. "Well, they have not met me." He stared at her, almost startled, as if unused to people willing to defy anyone on his behalf. The road curved left, and Ruby spotted the back of the diner ahead, dimly lit by a flickering sign. She pulled behind the building, cutting the engine a second before headlights appeared at the top of the hill. "Quiet," she whispered. Adrian nodded. They slipped out of the truck and hurried along the side of the diner, the rain drenching them instantly, until they reached the tree line. Ruby grabbed Adrian's arm, then pulled him deeper into the cover of the forest where the fog and darkness swallowed their silhouettes. They moved between towering pines, their shoes sinking into wet moss and fallen needles. Branches twisted overhead, forming a canopy that broke some of the rain, but amplified the sound of it so heavily that Ruby could barely hear her own breath. She listened for the SUV's engine and strained to make out shapes in the darkness. The world felt like one giant heartbeat pulsing around her. Adrian stumbled slightly, and Ruby steadied him, guiding him between two thicker trunks. "Stay low," she whispered. They crouched behind a fallen log, barely tall enough to shield them, but it was the only cover nearby. Adrian pressed a trembling hand over his mouth, trying to control his breathing. Footsteps. Flashlights cut through the rain-thin beams, weaving like cold white knives between the trees. Ruby froze and placed a steadying hand on Adrian's shoulder. Security voices carried faintly through the storm. The words were hard to distinguish, but she heard enough. "Bring him back. Do not let him slip." Adrian shut his eyes with an expression of deep shame. Ruby leaned close, whispering barely above a breath, "They will not find us. Not if you stay still." He nodded. Another beam of light swept dangerously close. Ruby inhaled sharply, and her instincts as a rescue tech kicked in. She knew how to remain silent, how to move in the dark, how to protect frightened creatures under pursuit. She reached up and gently pressed her fingers over Adrian's lips just as a flashlight passed 2 feet from their hiding place. Adrian stilled completely, his breath warm against her palm. Ruby could feel his heartbeat racing beneath the thin layer of the rescue jacket. For a moment, time seemed to stretch, the storm's roar fading until there was only the pounding of her pulse and the frayed electric tension between them. Emotional undulation surged through her, fear laced with something unexpectedly tender. The realization that she was the only barrier between him and the life he was desperate to escape. The flashlight beam receded. The footsteps moved away. Ruby waited several long seconds before slowly lowering her hand. Adrian exhaled shakily, his voice barely audible. "You saved me again." She shook her head quietly. "I just kept you hidden." But Adrian looked at her with something deeper than gratitude, something like awe, something that made her heart thump painfully. They remained crouched in the shadows until the last beams of light disappeared into the trees. Ruby finally rose, pulling Adrian with her. "We cannot stay here. Your family's team will search every part of this forest." He nodded, still shaken. "Where can we go?" Ruby scanned the darkness, thinking fast. "The animal rescue shelter," she said. "No one will think to look for you there." It was the only place she had keys to, the only place she knew well enough to navigate in the dark. She took Adrian's hand, letting the cold, wet grip anchor them both. "Come on, we have to move quickly." They slipped deeper into the forest, following Ruby's memory of the terrain, the crunch of wet earth underfoot guiding her back toward a path that would eventually lead to the service road north. Adrian kept up, though Ruby could sense how exhausted he was. Yet he did not complain. He simply trusted her. And as they emerged from the trees, leaving the danger behind for now, Ruby felt something shift between them, something unspoken, born from shared fear and survival. Tonight had taken them from strangers to something else entirely. Something neither understood yet, but both felt growing with every step they took into the storm. By the time Ruby and Adrian emerged from the forest, the storm had softened into a cold, steady drizzle that seeped through every layer of clothing and left a metallic taste in the air. Ruby guided him along the narrow maintenance road that curved behind the interstate toward the outskirts of Portland, where the animal rescue shelter sat tucked between a lumber yard and an abandoned nursery. The building was nothing impressive, a single-story structure with faded blue siding and a flickering security light, but to Ruby it had always been a place of warmth and purpose, a place where broken creatures could breathe again. She unlocked the side entrance with her key and ushered Adrian inside before the wind blew the door shut behind them. The sudden quiet wrapped around them like a blanket. The shelter always held a distinct mix of smells: wet fur, disinfectant, laundry detergent, peanut butter treats used to coax nervous dogs. But to Adrian, who had only known pristine marble floors and sterile hallways perfumed by expensive colognes. This space felt shockingly alive. Ruby switched on the dim overhead lights in the lobby, then motioned for him to follow her deeper into the building. He moved slowly, still shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion. The rescue jacket dwarfed his frame, giving him a strangely gentle appearance, like someone who had carried burdens far heavier than his own body. Ruby led him to the staff room, a small, cluttered space with metal lockers, spare uniforms, and a fold-out cot she used during late-night cases. She grabbed towels from a storage bin and handed them to him. "You are freezing. Dry off before you get sick." Adrian accepted the towels with a stunned gratitude, as if no one had ever handed him something so simple without expecting anything in return. Ruby pulled a sweatshirt from her locker and tossed it onto the cot. "It might be big on you, but it is dry." Adrian hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you." He changed while Ruby stepped outside the room, giving him privacy, though she kept glancing toward the hallway, half expecting headlights to appear through the front window. When Adrian finally emerged, wearing the oversized gray sweatshirt, his hair still damp, but his face less pale, Ruby felt an unexpected warmth stir in her chest. He looked human in a way he never had before, stripped of wealth or status, or the suffocating expectations that had marked his every movement earlier that night. She led him to the kennel room, where rows of enclosures lined the walls, each holding dogs recovering from abandonment or injury. Most were sleeping curled on blankets or dog beds, though a few lifted their heads when Ruby entered. The shelter always felt gentler at night, softer. The animals trusted Ruby instinctively, and tonight she needed that steadying energy. Adrian stood just inside the doorway, unsure whether to move closer. "They will not bite," she said with a faint smile. "They know who is safe." Adrian stepped forward slowly until a timid brown rescue dog pressed its nose through the bars and sniffed him cautiously. To Ruby's surprise, the dog gave a soft whine and wagged its tail, hesitant but hopeful. Ruby raised her eyebrows. "He usually does not go near strangers." Adrian crouched with a careful grace and let the dog sniff his hand. When the dog licked his fingers, Adrian's eyes softened in a way that made Ruby's breath catch. It was the first time she had seen him gentle with something without fear shadowing his features. "Animals do not care about money or power," Ruby said quietly. "They care about who you are underneath everything." Adrian nodded slowly, his expression turning thoughtful, almost mournful. "I do not think I have known who I am underneath anything, not for a very long time." Ruby wanted to say something to comfort him, but the words tangled in her throat. Instead, she motioned toward the break room. "Come on, you need food." He followed her into the small kitchenette, where she pulled a packet of instant ramen from the cupboard along with a kettle. It was not glamorous, but it was warm and grounding, and tonight that was enough. Adrian watched her with a strange tenderness as she poured hot water into the bowl. "No one has made food for me in years," he said quietly. Ruby glanced at him in surprise. "Surely someone has. A private chef, maybe?" "Staff?" Adrian shook his head. "They cook, but not for me. Not like this. Not with intention." Ruby did not know how to respond, so she handed him the steaming cup and let him eat in silence. He savored each bite with the slow, thoughtful care of someone experiencing something new rather than something ordinary. She folded the cot in the corner of the staff room and covered it with a blanket. "You can sleep here. You will be safe." Adrian sat on the edge of the cot bowl. Empty hands relaxed at last. "You have done more for me in one night than my family has in years." Ruby looked away, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "I just did what anyone with a heart would do." "That is not true," he murmured. "Most people see a runaway groom on the news and think of scandal. You saw a man drowning." The sincerity in his voice sent a tremor through her. She kept her gaze fixed on the floor, afraid that if she met his eyes she would feel something she was not ready to face. A soft sound broke the moment. The brown rescue dog had escaped its kennel again, something it managed to do with suspicious skill, and padded across the room before curling up at Adrian's feet. Ruby stared in awe. "He chose you." Adrian lowered his hand gently to the dog's head and the animal leaned into his touch. "I do not know why," he whispered. Ruby knew, because animals sensed pain, and they sensed goodness hidden beneath it. Adrian looked up at her, then the faintest, vulnerable smile appearing. "Can I stay here for a few hours, just until morning?" Ruby nodded slowly. "Of course. You are safe here." Adrian exhaled as though releasing the last of the panic that had held him hostage since the moment he fled the wedding. For the first time since Ruby found him on the highway, he let his shoulders drop and leaned back into the thin pillow. As Ruby dimmed the lights and the storm faded into distant rumbles, she felt the shift settling in the quiet space between them, the kind of shift that only comes when fear softens into trust. Tonight, a billionaire heir slept in a tiny rescue shelter protected not by security teams or wealth, but by a woman who had offered him warmth without asking anything in return. And, as she watched him drift into an exhausted sleep, Ruby realized this was the beginning of something neither of them could undo, something fragile and dangerous and real. Dawn crept in slowly, a pale gray wash behind the shelter windows, and for a brief moment Ruby allowed herself to believe the night had ended cleanly, that the storm had passed, and they had slipped out of danger. The animals stirred softly in their kennels' tails, thumping sleepily as if sensing Ruby's presence, and for the first time since picking Adrian up on the highway, she felt the faint promise of calm. She checked on him quietly. Adrian still slept on the cot, one arm resting over his forehead, the brown rescue dog curled tightly against his side as if guarding him. The sweatshirt Ruby gave him hung loose on his frame, and the visible exhaustion made it painfully clear how badly he had needed even a few hours of peace. Ruby stepped back into the hallway to prepare food for the animals. She moved silently through her normal morning routine, scooping kibble, replacing water bowls, checking the medication sheet. It was grounding work, familiar, almost soothing. But today, every small sound felt sharper, every breath tighter, as if some invisible thread was stretched to the brink. When she heard the crunch of tires on gravel outside the building, her entire body froze. The shelter rarely got visitors this early, and certainly never cars that sounded this heavy, this deliberate. Ruby crept toward the front window, staying low. Through the sliver of blind, she saw a long black SUV rolling to a stop at the entrance. Not the same one from the night before, but nearly identical. Her breath caught painfully in her throat. They had tracked them here. She could feel it in her bones. Another SUV parked beside the first, its headlights off its windows, impossibly dark. The realization slammed into her so quickly she had to grip the wall to steady herself. They found him. She rushed to the staff room, heart pounding so loudly she feared it would wake the entire building. "Adrian," she whispered urgently, shaking his shoulder. "Adrian, wake up." He stirred slowly, groggy from exhaustion. Ruby shook him again this time, with trembling urgency. "Adrian, please, you need to wake up now." The moment his eyes focused, he saw the fear on her face and sat up instantly. "What is wrong?" Ruby swallowed the rising panic. "They are here. I saw 2 SUVs outside. They tracked you to the shelter." Adrian's face drained of color. He stood too quickly, almost stumbling, before steadying himself on the back of the cot. "I told you," he murmured, voice cracking. "I told you they will not stop." Ruby grabbed his wrist. "We have to move. Now." She pulled him into the hallway, flipping off every light she had turned on earlier. The building dimmed back into its pre-dawn stillness, but the silence felt different now, charged with danger instead of peace. Footsteps echoed outside. Doors shut. Voices murmured, muffled but unmistakably authoritative. Ruby and Adrian hurried through the back corridor leading toward the utility room. Ruby pushed the brown dog back into its kennel, gently whispering, "Stay, boy. Stay quiet." Then she shut the door quickly as approaching footsteps grew louder. Adrian whispered, "Where can we go?" She scanned the building mentally. There was only one exit they could use without being seen, the back-loading door near the fenced yard. But to get there, they had to cross the hallway leading toward the intake room. And now shadows passed the frosted glass panel of the front entrance as the private protection unit entered. Ruby pressed Adrian against the wall behind a tall shelving unit just as the front door clicked open. Voices carried in clear, sharp tones. "The building is small. It will not take long to search. Split up. Check all rooms." Ruby's pulse hammered. She mouthed to Adrian, "Follow me." Slowly, they crept toward the intake hall. Ruby kept her steps light, her breath controlled, but inside she was already imagining the consequences. If they caught Adrian, he would be dragged back into the life he had run from, and she would become collateral damage, someone who interfered with the Billionaire dynasty. A door slammed open on the far side of the building. The sound jolted Ruby into motion. She pushed Adrian ahead of her. "Through here! Hurry!" They moved through the intake room, weaving between crates and boxes of donated pet food stacked ceiling high. A sudden beam of a flashlight swept across the far wall. They ducked. Ruby pressed her hand over Adrian's mouth again, instinctively feeling him still beneath her touch. Neither of them breathed. A security officer's voice echoed from the hallway. "He has to be here. The news station said someone spotted him near this area." Throats tightened. Footsteps grew louder. Ruby knew they had seconds. She whispered against Adrian's ear, "Go, now." They bolted through the utility door into the small fenced yard behind the building. Rain misted lightly from the lingering storm clouds. Ruby sprinted to the far end of the fence where she knew a loose panel had never been repaired. Adrian followed, but as he reached her, she heard a shout behind them. "Hey! Stop!" Ruby tore the panel free and shoved Adrian through the gap. He crawled out into the brush on the other side, then reached back for her. Ruby climbed halfway through when a flashlight beam hit her shoulder and a deep voice thundered, "Freeze." She hesitated for a fraction of a second that cost her, but Adrian gripped her arms and yanked her through the gap just as someone lunged from behind. They tumbled into the wet grass, landing hard. Adrian pulled her to her feet without pausing. Ruby gasped. "Come on, down the slope." They slid down the hillside, disappearing behind thick blackberry bushes. Rainwater soaked their clothes again as branches snagged at Ruby's jacket. Behind them, the officers scrambled at the fence, cutting through the brush in pursuit. Ruby and Adrian ducked beneath the cover of the shrubs and crawled until they reached a narrow drainage tunnel running under the old industrial road. Adrian hesitated. Ruby nodded, breathless and determined. "It is the only way." They slipped inside the tunnel, water cold around their knees, the darkness swallowing them whole. The shouts above grew fainter as they moved deeper into the passage. Ruby's hands shook, but she kept going, refusing to stop until the faint glow of dawn reappeared at the opposite end. They emerged into a ditch behind the lumber yard. Mud clung to their hands and knees, but the world was momentarily quiet. Adrian leaned against a stack of pallets trying to catch his breath. His voice cracked. "I am so sorry, Ruby. I did not want any of this to touch your life." Ruby shook her head fiercely. "You did not choose this. They chose to chase you, and I will not let them take you back to something that destroys you." Adrian turned toward her with disbelief and something deeper, something raw and grateful. Ruby met his gaze, feeling the weight of everything they had just endured together. The chase had forced their lives to collide in the harshest way. But standing there in the dim morning light, both drenched mud, streaked breathing hard, she understood something with startling clarity. His world had just crashed into hers. And she could not walk away now. Adrian stood against the stack of wooden pallets, breathing in sharp, uneven pulls while Ruby scanned the lumber yard for any sign of movement. The morning fog had thickened into a pale curtain that blurred the edges of everything, making the world feel both safer and more uncertain. The lumber yard was deserted at this hour, rows of stacked planks rising like silent walls around them. For a moment it felt like they had actually escaped. But Ruby heard the distant slam of car doors and the low rumble of engines repositioning nearby. The search was tightening. They had minutes at most. She turned back to Adrian, who looked even more exhausted than before. His hair was plastered to his forehead, his borrowed sweatshirt soaked and streaked with dirt, and his hands trembled not just from cold, but from sheer depletion. "You cannot keep running." Ruby whispered. "Not like this." Adrian shook his head, but his expression was not one of defiance. It was one of resignation. "I have been running my whole life. I can go a little longer." His voice cracked midway through the sentence, and he pressed a hand to the wooden pallet behind him, steadying himself as though the world kept tilting. Ruby reached for him, gripping his arms. "Adrian, you are freezing. You can barely stand. We need to get somewhere safe, regroup, plan." He gave a hollow laugh. "There is no plan that ends with me free." Ruby's heart dropped, but she kept her voice steady. "That is not true. We made it this far. We outsmarted them. We can do it again." Adrian looked at her with eyes full of both gratitude and disbelief. "Ruby, you do not understand what they are capable of. If you help me any further, they will tear your life apart. They will investigate you, threaten you, maybe even shut your shelter down for good." Ruby bristled with anger, not at him, but at the idea. "They tried that already, and we still got away." He stepped closer, gently taking her hand. "That is why this has to stop. You should not lose everything because of me." Ruby felt her throat tighten. She shook her head fiercely. "I am not scared of them." "You should be," he whispered, "and I am terrified of what happens to you because of me." Before Ruby could answer, a loud crack echoed from somewhere on the other side of the yard. A fence gate swinging open. Heavy boots on gravel. Ruby stiffened. Adrian turned toward the sound, instinctively placing himself between her and the danger, as if his body could shield her from an entire security team. The footsteps split into two directions, working their way around the perimeter. They were surrounding the yard. Ruby grabbed Adrian's hand. "We need to move. Now." But he didn't move. Instead, he stared at her with an expression that hollowed her out from the inside. "Ruby, I cannot keep dragging you into this. You did not sign up for it." She tightened her grip, refusing to let go. "We are in this together." Adrian's voice broke. "Ruby, they will find us again and again until someone gets hurt. I cannot let that be you." He took a shaky breath, and for the first time since she met him, Ruby saw a look in his eyes that frightened her more than the men hunting them. "Acceptance. Surrender, Adrian." Ruby whispered, "Please look at me. Do not do something stupid." But he had already made up his mind. He gently removed her hands from his sleeves and stepped back. His voice was soft but steady. "I am turning myself in." Ruby's breath left her in a single, painful rush. "No, Adrian, you cannot. You will go right back to the life you ran from. They will lock you down. They will use you. They will break you." Adrian shook his head. "They will not hurt me, but they will hurt you if I do not stop this now." Ruby felt something inside her crack open, raw and desperate. "Adrian, please. I can help you. We can fight this together." His voice softened. "Ruby, you already saved me. You gave me something I have not felt since I was a child. Safety, warmth. Someone who saw me, not the name, not the money, not the expectations. Just me." Her chest tightened painfully. "Then, stay with me. Let me keep helping you. Let me keep seeing you." Adrian looked away as though the words were too much to hold. "I want to," he said quietly. "I want that more than I should, but I will not let you lose your life because of mine." The footsteps grew louder now, coming from multiple angles. They were seconds away. Adrian turned toward the open space in the yard and stepped forward before Ruby could grab him. She followed him, voice trembling. "Adrian, stop." He paused just long enough to look at her over his shoulder, his expression soft and devastating. "Thank you for last night. Thank you for letting me be a person." Ruby felt tears burn behind her eyes. "Adrian, do not do this, please." He smiled gently. "You gave me the first night of peace I have had in years. I am going to protect that, even if it means protecting you from me." Then he stepped out from behind the stack of lumber fully visible to the search team. Ruby's heart plummeted. 3 men immediately turned their flashlights toward him. "Hands up," one of them shouted. Adrian raised his hand slowly. His voice stayed calm. "I am here. I will come quietly." Ruby stepped forward instinctively, but Adrian met her eyes, giving the smallest shake of his head, a silent plea. "Stay back. Do not let them see you. Do not get involved." She froze, trembling as they surrounded him. One of the officers grabbed his arm firmly. Adrian did not fight, did not resist, did not look away from her. As they began escorting him toward the SUVs, Ruby finally broke. "Adrian." He stopped mid-stride, turning his head just enough to hear her whisper cut through the morning air. "I am not letting this be the end." His expression flickered, softening with something like hope. Then he mouthed two silent words before they pushed him forward. "Thank you." Ruby stood rooted to the spot as the SUVs pulled away, carrying him back toward the life he had risked everything to escape. Her hands shook, her heartbeat thundered. But beneath the fear, beneath the heartbreak, one new emotion rose hot and steady in her chest. Determination. If he sacrificed himself to protect her, she would return the favor. She would fight for him now. She would not let a dynasty decide his future. Adrian had given himself up, but Ruby was just getting started. Ruby drove for 9 straight hours without stopping, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles ached. The highway blurred into a stream of gray and white as morning rain thickened across the Pacific Northwest, but she barely noticed. All she saw, again and again, was the moment Adrian looked back at her while security dragged him away. That small, soft expression. That silent thank you. It burned inside her like fuel. By the time the Seattle skyline rose ahead, steel glass and cold power stabbing into the clouds, Ruby's fear had hardened into something stronger. She parked 3 blocks from Westbrook Tower, the headquarters of Adrian's family empire, and the moment she stepped out of the car, she was hit by the noise. Reporters packed the sidewalks, camera flashes slicing through the drizzle. Dozens of police barricades surrounded the main entrance. Helicopters thumped overhead. Screens mounted on nearby buildings broadcast the same breaking headline across the city. Billionaire Groom returns after mysterious disappearance. Ruby pushed through the crowd, her hood pulled low, her heart pounding with each step. Westbrook Tower stood nearly 60 stories high, an obsidian monolith with a rotating silver logo at the top. The air around it felt heavy, like a place where choices were made for the world, not by the world. She moved toward the side entrance, trying to look like someone with a purpose, but her clothes were still creased from the chase, her hair unwashed, her eyes red from lack of sleep. A security guard stepped in her path. Employees only. Ruby paused, mind racing. I work with the cafe inside," she stammered. "I left my badge in my locker." The man gave her a once-over, unimpressed. "You and 20 reporters tried that today. Keep moving." Ruby's pulse spiked in frustration, but before she could argue, a woman wearing a cafe apron cracked the service door open and hissed, "Hey, you with the animal shelter, right?" Ruby blinked, startled. "How did you—" "I saw you bring those kittens in last month," the woman whispered. "You look like you're about to pass out. Get in before you get trampled." Ruby slipped inside as the employee shut the door behind her. The corridor was warm, quiet, and smelled faintly of coffee and industrial cleaning fluid. The woman lowered her voice. "You trying to get upstairs?" Ruby nodded, trying not to look suspicious. "The whole building is on lockdown. Press, lawyers, corporate board, even the bride's family showed up. It is chaos, but I can get you to the service elevator." Ruby exhaled in relief. "Thank you. Really?" The woman shrugged as if it were obvious. "You saved that kitten with the broken leg. People who save animals are automatically good people. Follow me." They wove through back corridors until they reached the freight elevator. The woman swiped her badge and held the door for Ruby. Floor 43. That is where they dragged him. Ruby's heart lurched. She stepped inside. The elevator doors shut. As it began to rise, Ruby felt the tremor of fear creeping into her stomach. She was heading into the heart of a billionaire dynasty's crisis, into a boardroom full of people who had no idea she existed, into a fight she had no certainty she could win, but she forced her shoulders straight. Adrian believed he had to sacrifice himself, fine. But she would not let that sacrifice swallow him whole. The elevator chimed softly at floor 43. The doors slid open, revealing a hallway lined with glass offices and heavy conference doors. The air here felt different, sterile, expensive, and tense. Voices echoed from down the hall, stern raised, overlapping. Ruby crept closer, staying pressed against the wall until she reached the largest conference room where the shouting was coming from. Inside, she saw it all. Adrian sat at the long glass table flanked by security, his wrists free, but his posture stiff as stone. His father, Lionel Westbrook, stood at the head of the table, authority radiating from him like cold fire. The bride's father, Gregory Armitage, was there too, red-faced and furious. Lawyers filled the remaining seats. Papers were stacked high. Contracts, settlement clauses, public statements waiting to be approved. Ruby's chest tightened. They were rewriting his life in front of him. Lionel slammed a document onto the table. "You will sign the revised agreement. The media storm is already costing us millions." Armitage's voice barked across the room. "You humiliated my daughter, our companies, this entire merger. If you think you can walk away from this unscathed." Adrian lifted his head slowly. His voice was quiet but firm. "I am not signing anything." Lionel's eyes narrowed to slits. "You do not have a choice." Adrian's jaw clenched. "Actually, I do." Ruby felt her breath catch. Lionel continued. "You will marry Elise as planned. You will repair the PR damage, and you will never embarrass this family again." Adrian's knuckles turned white against the table. "I am not property. I am not a bargaining chip." Ruby felt the room tilt. He was standing up to them, alone, against a dynasty. Armitage leaned forward, sneering. "You ran off like a child. You have no standing here." The room crackled with tension. Ruby's chest burned with indignation. She stepped forward, gripping the doorway frame. "Enough!" Every head whipped toward her. Adrian's eyes widened in shock. "Ruby!" Ruby swallowed her fear, forcing her voice to steady. "This is wrong. All of this. You are threatening him, forcing him, trapping him." Adrian stood slowly, as if afraid she was an illusion. "Ruby, what are you doing here?" Ruby kept her focus on the men at the table. "You are treating him like an asset, like a merger condition, not a human being." Lionel's voice cut through the room like steel. "Get her out, now!" A guard stepped toward her, but Ruby stepped back sharply, raising her voice. "Adrian has the right to choose his own life, and the world already knows he went missing before his wedding. Imagine how the world will react when they learn why." A ripple went through the boardroom. Uncertainty. Fear. Armitage snapped. "Do you think anyone will believe you?" Ruby met his gaze steadily. "I do not need them to believe me. I just need them to hear me." Adrian's father slammed his hand on the table. Silence. But it was too late. Ruby had broken into the sealed world of the Westbrooks. She had said the thing none of them wanted said aloud, and she saw something shift in Adrian, something fierce awakening beneath the exhaustion. Ruby looked at him, voice trembling, but sure. "You do not have to sign anything you do not want to. You do not have to live a life designed for someone else." Adrian stared at her like she was the one thing anchoring him in a room built to crush him. And Ruby realized with absolute clarity she was not just here to save him. She was here because she could not walk away from him. Not now, not ever. For a long moment after Ruby's words fell across the boardroom, no one moved. The silence felt electric, tense enough to snap. Adrian stood halfway out of his chair, staring at her as though he could not quite believe she was real. The lawyers froze, mid-page pens hovering. Elise Armitage's father turned a dangerous shade of red. And Lionel Westbrook, patriarch of the dynasty, stared at Ruby with the calm of a man used to crushing anyone who dared challenge him. When he finally spoke, his voice was a quiet blade. "This girl has no place in this room. Remove her." 2 guards stepped forward. Ruby braced, but Adrian moved first. He stepped in front of her so fast the guards faltered, startled. "Touch her, and every reporter downstairs will hear exactly what is happening in this room," Adrian said, his tone steady, controlled, terrifyingly calm. Ruby felt heat sting her eyes. He was choosing her, not a contract, not a merger, her. Lionel's jaw tightened. So, this is what this is about. You ran because of her. Ruby flushed, but Adrian didn't look away. No, I ran because of you. The room inhaled sharply. Adrian's voice rose steady but shaking with the weight of long-buried truth. I ran because you have spent my entire life deciding what I am allowed to want. You chose my schools, my career, my friends. You chose what I should look like, sound like, become like. And now you want to choose my marriage. Lionel shot back. I shaped you into a man worthy of this family. Adrian's laugh was soft, humorless. You shaped me into a hostage. Ruby felt her breath catch. Adrian continued. Every move I made was monitored. Every decision corrected. Every failure shamed. I have not had a free choice in 28 years. Lionel crossed his arms. You think this life is a burden? You have privilege, power, security. Adrian shook his head slowly. What good is privilege if it buys you a golden cage? His voice cracked, and Ruby took a tiny step closer, just enough that he felt her presence behind him. Elise's father slammed a folder shut. This is nonsense. You are panicking. You had cold feet. Signing this agreement will fix everything. Elise chose to enter. The room shifted. Elise, Armitage the bride, had been silent until now, seated in the far corner with her mother gripping her arm. She lifted her chin, eyes glossy but steady. I did not choose any of this. Everyone turned toward her. Elise's voice trembled but gained strength with every word. I begged my father not to go through with the merger wedding. I told him I did not want to marry someone I barely knew, just to unite two companies. Her father snapped Elise, stop, but she held her ground, surprising even herself. You forced me, she said to him, nails digging into the chair. You threatened to cut me off from everything. You said I owed you. Adrian blinked, shocked. Elise looked at him, and for the first time Ruby saw it, the same exhaustion, the same quiet desperation he carried. You do not love me, Elise whispered, and I do not love you. This marriage would destroy both of us. Lionel snapped. This is not about love. Elise let out a laugh that cracked in the middle. That is exactly the problem. Ruby felt her breath tremble. Elise stood facing her father, her voice shaking but fierce. I will not marry someone who has to be dragged to the altar. Release the agreement, Dad. I will not sign anything either. The room erupted at once. Elise's father shouted about reputation. Lawyers scrambled for damage control. Lionel barked orders that no one followed. The dynasty was fracturing right in front of them. Ruby's pulse pounded. She had never imagined Elise would speak up. Never imagined the truth would come from both sides of the supposed perfect wedding. In the chaos, Adrian turned to Ruby. Every emotion in his face, shame, gratitude, disbelief, hope, flickered like a storm. Ruby, he whispered, voice tight. You should not be here. Ruby stepped closer. Eyes locked on his. I had to be. Someone had to say the thing you were too alone to say. Adrian swallowed hard. You walked straight into the fire for me. Ruby felt her voice soften even through the adrenaline. You walked into it every day of your life. His breath hitched, but Lionel slammed a hand on the table, silencing everyone. Enough! His voice vibrated with fury so controlled it felt cold. You are still my son, and you are still bound to this family. Adrian lifted his head with a resolve Ruby had never seen before. No, I am bound to nothing. Lionel glared. You would walk away from everything. Your wealth, your inheritance, your position, your legacy. Adrian glanced at Ruby, then back at his father. If it costs me my freedom, then yes. Lionel stared at him stunned. Adrian continued. I am done being leveraged. I am done being used. If you want someone to control, find someone else. I am finished. The room went silent again, this time in disbelief. Ruby felt her heart swell with something so powerful it hurt. Adrian took a step forward, facing his father fully. "You do not get to decide my life. Not anymore." Elise wiped her eyes, whispering, "Thank you," to herself. Armitage sat in rigid fury. Lawyers whispered urgently among themselves, sensing that the contract was collapsing. Lionel's composure cracked for the first time. His voice thundered, "You are throwing away everything we built." Adrian shook his head. "No, you built a dynasty. I am choosing a life." Ruby felt the impact of those words down to her bones. Lionel stepped toward him, voice shaking with rage and disbelief. "And what then? Without this family, without our backing, without your position, what do you have?" Adrian inhaled slowly, and then he said the truth that broke everything in the room. "I have myself, and for once that is enough." Ruby felt tears prick her eyes. Elise exhaled in stunned relief. Armitage cursed under his breath. Lionel stood frozen, unable to process that his son, the heir he molded like a project, had dismantled his power with a single sentence. Adrian turned to Ruby, voice low but steady. "I choose freedom. I choose honesty. I choose the life I want." Ruby whispered, barely audible, "And what life is that, Adrian?" He looked at her with an expression so full of truth the room seemed to fade around them. "One where I get to decide who I walk beside. One where I am not owned. One where someone sees me." The boardroom collapsed behind them, arguments erupting, contracts slamming, lawyers yelling about legal fallout, but Ruby heard none of it. Adrian stepped toward her. The decision clear. The dynasty crumbling behind him. For the first time, he was truly free. Chaos still thundered behind them as Adrian stepped out of the boardroom, but Ruby barely heard any of it over the thundering in her own chest. He stood close enough now that she could see the faint tremble in his hands, the adrenaline still clinging to him after confronting the entire dynasty that had ruled his life since childhood. He had walked away from all of it, from money, power, inheritance, reputation, and he was still breathing, still standing, still choosing something other than fear, choosing her. The hallway outside the conference room hummed with distant voices and the low buzz of corporate machinery waking up for the day. But here, in this small pocket of quiet, he looked at Ruby as though the world had just narrowed down to the space between them. "Ruby," he whispered, his voice raw. She felt her throat tighten. "Adrian, what you just did. You threw away everything they told you was yours." He shook his head slowly. "No, I threw away everything that was never mine to begin with." He took a breath that shuddered out of him. "I do not want their world. I want a life that feels real." His eyes found hers, and something deep inside her softened, then twisted with emotion. Ruby stepped closer. "They are going to make this very hard on you." Adrian let out a small, tired laugh. "They have been making my life hard for 28 years. For the first time, I made something hard for them." But as confident as he tried to sound, Ruby could see the cracks, the exhaustion, the weight of what he had just dismantled. He had stepped out of decades of control into nothing but uncertainty. And yet, he kept looking at her as though that uncertainty felt less terrifying because she was standing in it with him. Ruby swallowed hard. "We should get you out of this building, before someone tries to force you back inside." Adrian nodded slowly. "Let us go." But as they moved toward the service elevator, Adrian hesitated, glancing over his shoulder at the conference room. Even from here, they could still hear Lionel's thunderous voice, lawyer scrambling, Elise arguing with her father. The empire was cracking open in real time. Adrian turned back to Ruby. "I thought leaving would feel like falling apart, but it feels like breathing." She reached for his hand without thinking, and he let her hold it. His fingers curled around hers, warm, despite everything they had endured in the last 24 hours. When they stepped into the service elevator, the doors slid shut with a dull metallic thud, sealing them away from the dynasty unraveling upstairs. Adrian leaned against the wall, shutting his eyes as though savoring the first moment of true quiet. Ruby watched him silently. He looked younger, lighter, like someone rediscovering the outline of his own identity. When he opened his eyes, he stared at her with something fragile and unguarded. "Ruby, I meant what I said. Every word." "I know," she whispered. "I saw it in your face." He let out a soft breath that was almost a laugh. "I thought the hardest thing I would ever do was walk away from everything I was raised to be. But the hardest thing is this." He stepped closer, gently taking her hand again. Ruby's breath caught. Adrian lowered his voice. "The hardest thing is letting myself admit what last night meant to me." Ruby's chest tightened. The elevator hummed downward. The city moved beneath them, and between them hung a truth they had been circling since the moment she stopped her key on that rain-soaked highway. "Adrian," Ruby whispered, barely audible. "You do not owe me anything for helping you. This is not about owing," he said. "It is about choosing." The elevator reached the lobby. The doors slid open, but neither of them moved. Not yet. Adrian looked at her with a vulnerability so quiet it was almost reverent. "Last night when you stopped your car, that was the first moment in my life someone saw me without agenda, without expectation, without wanting anything from me." Ruby's eyes stung. Adrian's voice grew softer. "You saved me in a way no one ever has. Not from danger, but from the belief that I had no right to choose who I wanted to be." Ruby felt the truth ripple through her like warmth breaking through cold. She stepped closer until they were barely inches apart. Adrian, Ruby murmured. "You saved me too." His breath hitched. "How?" She gave a small, trembling smile. "Because you made me realize kindness still matters, that helping someone is still worth it even if it wrecks your routine, your sleep, your entire sense of safety. You reminded me why I chose this life, why I chose rescue work in the first place." Adrian blinked, looking stunned and softened all at once. The lobby was quiet at this early hour, the security desk manned but distracted by the chaos happening upstairs. Ruby and Adrian slipped out unnoticed into the gray Seattle morning. The city felt cold and damp, but to Ruby, stepping beside him felt inexplicably warm. They walked for several blocks in silence until they reached a quiet bus stop tucked between a bookstore and a small bakery just opening for the day. Ruby stopped here, turning toward him. "You are free now. But you need time, breathing space, a place to think." Adrian nodded slowly, absorbing her words. "I do not know what comes next, but I know one thing." Ruby tilted her head. "What is that?" Adrian's voice softened into something that made her pulse skip. "I want my next choice to be mine. Not the dynasties, not the boards. Mine." Ruby swallowed. "And what choice is that?" Adrian stepped closer just enough that she felt the warmth of him in the cool morning air. His voice cracked with sincerity. "I choose you." Ruby inhaled sharply, her chest tightening with a warmth that raced through her. Adrian continued. "I choose the woman who saw me on the road and did not drive away. I choose the person who risked everything to stand beside me in that boardroom." Ruby felt a tear slip down her cheek before she could stop it. Adrian reached up gently, brushing it away with the back of his fingers. Ruby whispered, "Adrian, you do not have to say this now. You are overwhelmed, exhausted." But he shook his head softly. "I have never been more certain of anything." Ruby's breath trembled. Her heart felt too full. The city hummed around them, but it all felt distant, fading. The only thing that felt real was him standing here in the soft gray light, choosing a life defined not by power, but by humanity. Adrian leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. Their foreheads touched first, a quiet grounding connection that made her chest ache. Then his lips brushed hers in a gentle, tentative kiss, not fueled by urgency or adrenaline, but by something deeper, something steady and healing. When they finally pulled back, Ruby's voice shook with emotion. "What now?" Adrian gave a soft smile. "Now we figure out a future built on choice." Together. 6 months later, the Pacific Northwest summer unfurled across Oregon with soft, warm breezes that carried the earthy scent of pine and asphalt dust. Ruby stood outside the newly refurbished Westbrook Animal Rescue Fund headquarters, staring up at the sign that still did not feel real. The building used to be an abandoned warehouse on the edge of Portland, but now sunlight poured through tall windows into bright open rooms designed for healing recovery and community. The transformation had taken months of sweat, long nights, and moments where Ruby wondered if they had taken on too much too fast. But every time she doubted, she would remember the look on Adrian's face the morning he walked out of Westbrook Tower and chose freedom instead of dynasty. That memory steadied her every time. Inside, volunteers bustled from room to room as kittens meowed from playpens and rehabilitated dogs wagged their tails at anyone who came near. Ruby walked through the space, absorbing its energy, a warm hum that pulsed with purpose. She found Adrian crouched near the large outdoor play area fixing a latch on one of the gates. He wore jeans and a faded navy t-shirt, the kind of outfit she once could not imagine him in. The man she met on the highway had been wrapped in constraints: money, power, pressure, image. The man kneeling in the grass now was simply Adrian. No dynasty, no control, just himself. She approached quietly, watching how the sun caught in his hair. "You know," she said teasingly, "I did not hire you as head of maintenance." Adrian looked up with an easy grin. "And yet, here I am, the only one who can fix this stubborn gate." He tugged the metal, gently proving his point. Ruby folded her arms. "You could assign someone else to do that, you know," he shrugged. "I like doing it. It feels real." She softened at the honesty in his voice. That was one of the biggest changes she had seen in him over the past 6 months. He spoke more, said what he felt, shared what hurt him, laughed without fear of being judged. For so long he had been taught that vulnerability made him weak, but the freedom to feel had rebuilt him in ways that still surprised her. A volunteer called Ruby's name from inside, needing help with a newly admitted dog. Ruby jogged over, but even as she worked, she kept glancing out the window at Adrian, noting how he moved more comfortably in the world. Seeing that quiet confidence bloom had been one of the most unexpected joys of her life. Later that afternoon, Ruby and Adrian sat in the break room sharing coffee while a warm breeze drifted through the open window. The shelter's brown rescue dog, the same one who had curled against Adrian at the shelter on the night they met, rested at his feet. The dog rarely left Adrian's side anymore. Ruby sipped her coffee. "The grand opening event is next week. Are you ready?" Adrian nodded, but his smile carried a hint of nervousness. "Ready as I will ever be." The boardroom confrontation still lived in the back of his mind, though he rarely spoke of it unless Ruby asked. His father had attempted to recover control, but the public support for Adrian after the scandal made it difficult. A quiet settlement was eventually reached. Adrian walked away permanently from the Westbrook empire with enough personal assets to live comfortably but not lavishly, and he chose to allocate a large share of it to the rescue fund. What surprised Ruby most was that Adrian did not miss the old life, not once. He glanced at her fingers, tapping gently on her mug as if working up courage for something. "Ruby, can I ask you something?" She nodded. "Anything." Adrian pushed his mug aside and leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "When you picked me up that night, you had no reason to trust me. I was a stranger soaking wet in the middle of the highway. Why did you stop?" Ruby smiled softly, but her voice held gravity. "Because you looked like someone who had run out of places to go, and I know what that feels like." Adrian watched her for a long, silent moment, letting the truth settle between them. Then he said quietly, "You changed everything for me." She felt heat rise in her chest. "And you changed me too." He reached out and she let her hand slide into his. They sat in the quiet moment before the afternoon shift resumed. The peaceful hum of animals playing outside drifted in, and Ruby felt something she had not felt in years, a sense of home that stretched beyond walls and work. Later that evening, they drove out to the exact stretch of I-5 where Ruby had stopped her car 6 months earlier. The storm had long since passed, replaced now by golden sunlight settling over the wetland fields. Ruby stood by the guardrail looking out at the horizon. "It feels different in the daylight," she murmured. Adrian joined her hands in his pockets. "This is where my life split open," he said quietly, "and somehow got put back together again." Ruby tilted her head. "You put it back together, Adrian. I just saw where the cracks were." He turned toward her fully, his expression softening into something vulnerable earnest. "You were the first real choice I ever made." Ruby felt her breath catch. "And I would make it again," he added, "every time." He stepped closer until the heat of his body brushed hers. The wind carried the faint scent of pine and highway asphalt. He reached up, gently brushing a loose strand of hair from her cheek. Ruby looked up at him, feeling her pulse steady into something warm and sure. Adrian whispered, "Can I walk beside you this time? Not run." Ruby's smile trembled. "You already are." He exhaled a breath that sounded like release, like hope, like freedom finally finding a place to land. They stood together watching the road that had changed both their lives. Not with fear this time, but with gratitude. The world had torn Adrian away from everything he thought he was, but kindness had brought him to a future he could choose, one built not on power or expectation, but on something far rarer: connection, trust, love. Ruby slipped her fingers into his and he intertwined them gently. Whatever came next, they would choose it together. If you are still here with Ruby and Adrian, then you already know this is not just a story about a runaway groom or a billionaire fleeing a dynasty. It is a story about the moment a single act of kindness can change the entire course of two lives. And if this story reached you today, if it made your heart race or slow down or ache or heal even a little, then stay with me for just a moment more, because now I want to ask you something. When was the last time your life changed because of a choice you almost didn't make? Maybe it was a stranger you decided to help. Maybe it was a risk you finally took. Maybe it was a moment when you realized you deserved more than the world wanted you to settle for. Stories like Ruby and Adrian's remind us that sometimes the smallest decisions, slowing down, stopping the car, opening the door, offering warmth, can shape everything that comes next. And if you want more stories like this, more late-night escapes from dynasties, more love found on highways, more healing kisses under gray morning skies, more characters who choose humanity over power and tenderness over fear, then I would love to keep telling these stories for you. All you have to do is hit like so YouTube knows you want more. Subscribe if you have not yet, so you will never miss the next romance that begins where least expected. And if you want to help this story travel farther, help it reach someone who needs a little hope tonight, share it with a friend or leave a comment below. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me which moment hit you hardest. Was it the instant Ruby stopped in the rain? Was it the look Adrian gave her in the boardroom? Was it the quiet kiss at the bus stop? Or was it something smaller, some detail that whispered to you when you least expected it? I read every comment you leave, and every time you share your heart with this channel, it helps me understand the kind of stories you want more of. And if you are part of our community already, you know we are building something special here. A place for healing romance. A place for the slow, quiet kind of love that grows even in the storms of the world. A place where ordinary people meet extraordinary moments and discover they are worthy of being chosen. If that is the kind of world you want to return to again and again, you are already part of it. And for those who made it to the very end of this story, here is your special question, the one only true story lovers answer in the comments. If you had been driving that night on I-5, would you have stopped for Adrian? Or would you have kept driving? No judgment, no pressure, just honesty. Your answer tells its own story. And lastly, thank you for spending this time with me. Thank you for trusting me with your imagination and your heart. Until the next story, take care of yourself, take care of the people who cross your path, and remember even the smallest act of kindness can rewrite a destiny. I will see you in the next one.